Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 45. Now today I'm joined by Joseph Woodward for a chat all about the Go programming language. Now I seem to be seeing this lately everywhere, and a lot of open source tools that I rely on heavily, when I look at them on GitHub, they seem to be written in Go too. So Joe is an ex.NET developer, but now avid Go developer, and given a lot of the listeners are probably .NET devs, as am I thought Joe, who's used both C# and Go, would be an ideal person to help us compare and contrast. I'm sure I'm not the only .NET dev who's a little bit curious about Go. So Joe, welcome to the show.
Hello Dan, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So could you introduce yourselves to listeners and tell us a bit about what you do?
Oh goodness. All right. Hello, I'm Joe. I live in the UK, southwest of the UK, 3 children. I've been programming since I was, young. Get into, playing games. It seems to be a lot of ways people get into programming, building a website for games I liked, and eventually you realize you can do it as a job, and it's a job I love doing. These days I work fully remotely at an organization called Form3, but prior to that I was doing a lot of .NET. It's previously Just Eat, a couple of places before that as well. So about sort of 8 or 9 years doing .NET, PHP before that as well. Yeah, I think that's about it really for me. Very boring person really.
I'm just thinking about the times when I've done PHP, and I'm embarrassed to admit that. But
I know. I'm always conscious about slagging off, not necessarily slagging off lounges. I don't want to imply that you do that, but speaking ill of lounges, because I know there are some people out there making perfectly good livings with them. So it is what it is. I that was how I got into programming in the first place, because it was very easy to learn. At the time, you could just drag and drop a PHP file onto a server, press refresh, and it all worked. It's quite forgiving. The type system was quite forgiving. So maybe had I not learnt with such an easy experience to get into building software, then I wouldn't be here today. So the web was in its infancy at the time. JavaScript was very early. So yeah, at the same time, I do kind of give it a bit of leeway for that reason.
I'm just thinking about with PHP, with all the HTML with code intermingled with it, and then you think back, actually we're kind of like almost circling back round to that now, aren't we, with some technologies?
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, when you see things like React start to embed, or I suppose more componentize, or rethink how to distribute these components and what makes up a component. But yeah, it does make me think of the times when I had PHP plastered with HTML.
So I'm just thinking back to when we actually first met each other, and I think it was one of the DDD conferences, and we had an episode on, one of the earlier episodes on the DDD. It was a group episode, so there was a few of us in there, which was quite good fun. And I don't know whether I've mentioned this to you actually, but because I'm a big fan, as you know, of IDEs and productivity in IDEs. And if I think back to things that have made me try to get more productive, I can think of 2 people. One was an ex-colleague, like many, many years ago. I won't mention his name because he might not want to be mentioned on a podcast, but he was really, really good at ReSharper. And I remember seeing that and just thinking, I need to get better as well. So I worked hard to get more productive with ReSharper. And I remember I've seen a few of your talks at the DDD conferences where you were just whizzing around Rider so fast. And that was the second point which made me think, I need to get even faster now. So thank you for that.
Oh, I'm glad I left a good impression. Probably a lot of that to do with nerves as well, because whenever you're presenting or demoing, especially live coding, the nerves get the better of you sometimes, and you do. Other than fumbling, you maybe go a bit too fast.
Well, speaking of editors and productivity and editors, we're actually doing a second episode. Well, as soon as we finish this, actually, but obviously there'll be a gap until we publish it. But we're recording them back to back, which I don't normally do. But the next episode we're going to do is about Vim, because we're both big fans. And I don't normally have back to back guests on, but I just really want to talk about Vim, so I'm going to break the rules a bit. So
I'm looking forward to talking about Vim as well.
That should be good fun. Cool. So before we get on to talking about Go, I'm just going to do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes to Sean Studdard, who tweeted out, just came across a great podcast, the Unhandled Exception podcast. The topic today was very timely, observability with Martin Thwaites and Honeycomb, and a free book to our lucky listener. And he's put in brackets, me, ? So sadly, I'm afraid, if I remember correctly, you weren't the winner this time, but maybe next time. So thank you so much for your tweet, Sean. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag unhandledexception. All feedback is greatly appreciated. And I'm Dracan on Twitter, which is Dracan. And don't forget that this podcast now has its own Slack channel. And if you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a big shiny Slack link there. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Right, okay, so let's talk about Go then. Now, first of all, I have a small confession. I was planning to do a bit of reading and playing around with Go this week, as I've never used it before, but then life got in the way. So I currently know nothing. And I'm going to ask all sorts of really dumb questions, but hopefully that makes me a good voice for the listeners who might also not know anything about Go.
Yes, I was going to say it's probably a good idea because, you'd be a good voice for the listeners then. You don't want to assume everybody knows what Go is and some of those common things that people may not actually realise or know.
So as I mentioned earlier, you're an X.NET developer who's now moved to Go. And I see you're tweeting a lot, raving about Go. Was there something specific that attracted you to Go, or was it just, did you feel time for change?
I think personally it was a mix of things. I really enjoyed doing .NET, but I've always had an interest in kind of the infrastructure side. I'm a big fan of the observability space. So a lot of that tooling is written in Go, and Go is primarily designed as an infrastructure language. So naturally, a lot of those products like Prometheus being written in Go as well, I kind of gravitated towards read and Go. And then a couple of opportunities arose at work to use it. And it kind of started from there, really. I think at the same time, I started in PHP, I did some Java, went to .NET, and I'm conscious of, I want to kind of continue on that journey of being a polyglot programmer. And I think it's healthy to learn new languages. And I suppose I was conscious of becoming just a .NET developer. It's very easy to just kind of stay in one language, just continue to kind of, continue my journey as a polyglot developer. At that point I kind of thought, well, there's an opportunity here. Maybe I should spend a bit of time doing some Go. Now, I suppose earlier on as well, you said I'm an X.NET developer, which I guess in some cases might be true, but I don't consider myself X. There's an opportunity that I might go back to it at some point. At the moment, I'm really enjoying what I do, but never say never. So I haven't dabbled in .NET for about a year now. But, I haven't kind of cut ties with it completely. I just haven't written it in a while.
I need to get better at other languages, really. My background was C and C++, like a long time ago. Then I moved to .NET. And because I do full stack, so I'm doing like JavaScript and TypeScript and that kind of thing. But excluding like web front-end technologies or languages, then I haven't really played around with lots of different things. I've done a little bit on F# playing around, but... And there's some different languages like Haskell, like Go, all these different things that I should really be playing around with, but time, you know what it's like.
That's the thing, isn't it? Anybody with family or other commitments, you do have to balance those. Nobody's going to remember you for knowing lots of different languages, to be a good parent and whatnot. But yeah, I suppose, some people are always interested in picking up new languages or learning new languages. But I suppose as well, that's one of the things Microsoft are quite good at. They're very good at building tooling to accommodate developers. And they've built a really good ecosystem of different languages you can use and provide different tooling. And that can sometimes make you quite insulated, or one of the side effects of it is it can keep you quite insulated. You kind of get into that Microsoft bubble. You've got everything you need. You've got Azure, C#, the .NET runtime. If you want to learn another language, there's F#, Visual Studio. They kind of tick all of those boxes. So sometimes there's not always that need to venture outside of it, which I certainly found as a .NET engineer. When I started thinking, I want to learn a functional programming language, there's F# to learn. So I kind of felt like, okay, the conscious decision is I want to learn a language that isn't a Microsoft-backed language.
Yeah. I do kind of feel that it probably is changing now, because if you think back to .NET Framework, where it was very Windows, very corporate, and so the type of developer that would do that probably wouldn't be interested in these other languages, because it's so that they're so born and bred Windows and IS and all this kind of thing. Where now, like I by default host my .NET core, well, I can't say core, .NET 6 applications in Kubernetes. It's cross-platform, so I'm by default doing it in Linux. And it's much smaller, faster, and I'm much more likely to just reach for other technologies and languages. It's open source. I think someone that's now getting used to this space, and you mentioned Prometheus before, so I kind of use Prometheus and all that kind of stack. So it feels like it's just becoming less Microsofty because it's open to more people. But anyway, we're not here to talk about .NET. We're here to talk about Go. I just realised. So
No, but to your point, you are correct there, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons I started looking at Go, because you look at VS Code, and Microsoft have done a fantastic job with VS Code, and I think it's actually one of the most popular Go editors as well. And you're totally right. Since the past couple of years, they've leaps and bounds in opening up the ecosystem and introducing lots of different technologies as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was actually going to ask about, you mentioned about tooling and then you mentioned VS Code. I was going to ask that what would be your default editor for Go? And you mentioned VS Code, and I know we mentioned Vim before. But with .NET, obviously we've got Visual Studio, but both you and I, when we do .NET, we use Rider anyway. I believe JetBrains that created Rider have got something called GoLand.
Yeah, that's right, it's GoLand. Yeah, I suppose if you're familiar with JetBrains IDEs, as I was, then GoLand is the natural choice. I think that's one of JetBrains' strong points as tooling developers, is their IDEs are very similar. I started PHP using PHP Storm, which is a JetBrains product, and went to Visual Studio, where ReSharper kind of introduced a lot of the JetBrains shortcuts that I'm used to. So it was kind of just a natural progression from then. So yeah, definitely, if you're used to JetBrains tooling, then GoLand is a fantastic IDE. I think they only have paid for licenses at the moment for GoLand. So I suppose if you're just interested in experimenting with it, then maybe Visual Studio Code would be a good place to start. The tooling in VS Code is really good. And the Google supported plugin to enable GoLand development in VS Code is really powerful as well, and ticks a lot of the boxes that you'd probably need.
Or just wait till next week and listen to our episode on Vim. Magic.
Oh yeah. I mean that. If you want to, if you're new to Vim, that'll be an adventure for you.
So, how did you actually go about learning Go? You're already an experienced developer. Was it quite easy to pick up?
I think so. Yeah. So that's one of the premises behind the design philosophies for Go. Go, a bit of a history, I suppose, for the listeners that maybe don't have too much context of it or have only heard of it. Go is originally designed and developed at Google, I think back in 2007. The main design philosophy was to improve programmers' productivity in kind of a multi-core era, network machines. It's really designed around that premise. Being a new language as well, they were able to learn a lot from other languages, and they were quite picky as to what they wanted to include in there. From the get-go, they designed the language to be a very simple language with, just a select number of features. So, for instance, earlier versions of Go up until recently didn't include generics, which is always a bit of a surprise to people that are first interested in learning it. But ultimately, the language is designed as an infrastructure language, and they wanted it to be highly readable. So as a result, it is very easy to pick up and to become proficient with it quite quickly. You said yourself you have a history with C and C++. The language itself is based on C. And actually, when you look at C and look at Go, they do look very similar. But it's an incredibly easy language to read. You can just take a look at a single Go file and very quickly get a grasp as to what's going on without having to understand any complex syntax that you might have with other languages.
Am I right that just like C and C++, which is a compiled language to machine code, that Go is the same?
Yes, that's right. I suppose the slight difference with Go is it also compiles into this single binary. It compiles the runtime, but it ultimately leads to these really small compiled self-executing binaries. And it's interesting actually to see the influence that Go has had on the broader language ecosystem. It seemed like .NET have been inspired by some of Go's design philosophy and some of the things that exist in Go, as have other languages. So maybe we could talk about that later on.
Yeah, definitely. Even like functional stuff where like .NET and, not just .NET, but you can see how different languages are learning from each other and then bringing features in. I find that really interesting. And it's quite important, really, because it's kind of when it comes down to it, we all want our languages to get better. So if you don't learn from other language, well, so if the language designers don't learn from other languages, then they're not doing as good a job as they could have done.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's a great thing about having, a diverse ecosystem, isn't it? Is the rising tide lifts all ships. It's always great to see how, one language influences another language. And it's also equally great to see recently in GitHub, there were some discussions. I can't remember exactly the exact language feature in Go, but some of the .NET team kind of jumped on and started offering their advice based on their experiences and what they would have done differently in hindsight. So it's always interesting to see, and nice to see these kind of languages getting along like this, and those teams that develop those languages of sharing ideas and kind of working to make a better world all around for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned earlier that Go starts off as like an infrastructure language. And if I look on the website, I think it mentions that. It mentions console apps. It mentions web apps. It doesn't mention like mobile apps or desktop apps, but I did a bit of just a quick Google, and it looks like there's projects that help you out with that, so you can still create desktop apps and mobile apps. Have you actually played around with any of those?
No, I haven't. I have seen, I have seen them out there, but I don't have a lot of experience with them. I suppose I've been doing Go now professionally for about a year and a half. I haven't seen too much in the way of their adoption. They seem to be sort of from my uneducated and inexperienced opinion here, they seem to be sort of a fringe developers using them. I could be completely wrong with that, so I'd love to to know how true that is. But yeah, I don't have much experience with them. But there are some options out there. I know that. Same with game engines. There's a couple of smaller Go-based game engines. Again, I'm not sure on sort of how broadly adopted they are outside of the Go ecosystem.
Well, I can try and include like the ones I found before. I'll include some links in the show notes just for reference. But yeah, it'd be quite interesting. If any of the listeners are Go developers that have played around with this, it'd be really interesting to hear from you.
Yeah, do please correct me, because I'd love to know.
So just thinking about so I know we're going back to comparing with .NET, but that's the main language I know and probably what a lot of the listeners know. I'm just thinking about like what core differences there are. So like is it typed? Is there a garbage collector? All this kind of thing.
Yes, so there is a garbage collector included in Go's runtime. It is typed. I suppose if you were to take a .NET developer or a developer that's been a lot of experience in .NET and C#, opening a Go file for the first time, I suppose the first thing they would notice is probably how easy the code base is to read. The Go language designers wanted to create a language that was really, really easy to read, because the philosophy being that when you write code once, but you read it forever and you have to maintain that code. So a lot of the language design philosophies are based around that premise of maintainability. I think what was really interesting, there was a good video by Rob Pike, one of the lead language designers recently, which I'll send you a link to include in the show notes, where he says one of the reasons, or the number of reasons he thinks Go succeeded, and one of them was because it was designed and developed as a language for software engineering as opposed to programming. So as a newcomer, a lot of the things that you'll notice is consistency, because one of the core premises of Go when they first designed it is they wanted to have a consistent code base. So they've baked that into some of the tooling. You have baked in formatters that will format Go, and very opinionated as how Go is structured. You save the code and it will reformat it for you. So you'll notice a lot of consistency between various different code bases, which makes jumping between code really simple. You'll probably notice a huge lack of language features, and that was a big learning curve for me, is I had to cut ties with things like link when learning Go, because they have just a bunch of sort of basic language primitives.
I think that if I moved languages, the one you mentioned then, link, would be the thing I missed. That would definitely be the main thing.
I know, right? Yeah, and it is. There are times even these days when I'm writing Go and I'm thinking, this would be so much easier to write in, say, C#. But it's almost like I have this opposing opinion that, okay, it will be easy to write, but it'll be more difficult to read for the future me. And there have been instances where I've wanted to do something really fancy that I would maybe have done so in another language. But then in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't, because, it's now easier to read and easier to comprehend. And sometimes just a more simple approach is often better than trying to be smart. I suppose I'm guilty sometimes of looking at a piece of code and thinking, how can I make this, really clever to show how clever I am? And people will see it and think, wow, that's really clever. But that isn't always necessarily the right approach. And Go, I suppose, makes it a little bit more challenging because it is so bare in terms of the language features.
I don't believe you. I don't think you're writing code thinking you're clever. I think you're saying to be sharper, I'll tenter. He suggested this. I can convert this to link. Oh, look at that one liner.
Yeah, you got me there. Yeah, basically, that's the way I would do it.
It is nice that ReSharper and Rider can do that, but just what made me think about this was actually when you were saying about link being hard to read, which I don't think link statements should be hard to read, but some of the link statements ReSharper has generated for me, I was like, no, undo, backtrack.
Yes, yeah, I think some language features, they're fantastic features, and I agree. It's not hard to read, but sometimes they can be abused. They can sometimes be a bit of a foot gun, and we've all seen complex link expressions. I suppose is what I was alluding to. But I do miss some of those features, and they do exist in some form in Go. But after a while, I stopped missing them because a lot of the times just a for loop did the job. For loop and passing a function. But it is what it is. And as somebody that is interested or may be interested in learning Go, sometimes you do have to say farewell to some of those language features that you might be used to. But at the same time, when in Rome, I went into it with an open mind, having done Go previously and thinking, my goodness, how could somebody work like this? And after a while, I started to grow fond of the simplicity of the language and really enjoy writing it as well.
One of my favourite acronyms, KISS. I'm not going to go with the original one, but I call it now, keep it super simple.
Yeah.
It's a bit more pleasant than the original.
Yes.
I saw, I can't remember where I found it now. I think it was just tweeted out last week, and someone had put, you might have seen it because it became quite popular on Twitter. It was an infographic showing developers' experience over time and their code, like basically complexity over time. And it basically shows like a newbie programmer writing simple code, and then as they get a bit more experienced, it becomes really complicated where they're adding lots of every single design pattern under the sun, and then as they get more experienced, this curve of the graph shoots back down and goes back to simple again.
Yeah, it kind of resets itself, doesn't it? As you go through the experience and come back down the other side, you end up back where you began in terms of, just trying to write maintainable code. It
was on Twitter, and someone, because I remember now, and someone replied saying, yeah, but that's simple of the junior developer and the very experienced developer looks very different. So, which is a good point.
Yeah, I always struggle with, when people say simple and complex, like what does that mean? Write the simplest thing, like what does that mean? It's very easy to say in conversation, I suppose, but, sometimes it's very difficult to explain, what the simplest solution might be. Sometimes you make the trade-offs, but I digress.
Well, I suppose something that's probably close related is dependency injection, where you've got the kind of like IOC containers and all these kind of things. Does Go have something similar, or do they try and keep that simple as well?
I suppose Go has dependency injection in the style of you can inject your dependencies. It doesn't have an IOC container to satisfy those dependencies. So dependencies are usually managed via things called like a basic constructor injection. So a Go type doesn't have a constructor. So there's a common idiom to use what's called a factory function, which, if you've read Martin Fowler's refactoring book, factory function is quite a common design pattern. And it just uses sort of some simple approaches like that. Along the way, there have been design decisions that the community have crowded around and established as, all right, this is the way we'll do it moving forward. So there are a couple of IOC containers out there, but they're not particularly popular. I think one of the things that the Go engineering team did quite well when they created Go is they created a set of idioms that kind of set the standards that they want the broader community to adopt, similar to Python. I believe Python had a bunch of idioms around sort of simplicity and design philosophy that started to embed into conversations within the community. So when some of these more complicated ideas are raised by the community, then some people start to fall back and say, well, actually, these are kind of against Go's design philosophies. And you see that's echoed out in the standard library as well, which has steered the general community in a way of trying to keep things as simple as possible. which has, stemmed the adoption of maybe some of these more complicated, not necessarily complicated, but fraught with danger ideas such as IOC containers. The downside being naturally you have to manage dependencies manually. But yeah, again, it is what it is. They do exist, but they're not often used. People tend to prefer just, setting up your dependency tree manually, the composite root, the root composition. Yeah.
There is definitely something to be said for just having one common way of doing things. It's like you mentioned before about the prettifying and making all the code look the same and everyone's following the same convention. And then, yeah, with kind of injection, if it's just all done very similar ways, especially if you're jumping between different open source projects that might be using Go, because you mentioned Prometheus. Another piece of software which I know we both use, we've spoken about before, K9S, the Kubernetes GUI, which is actually, it's a console application, but it looks like a desktop application because of the way it's laid out, but you run it in the console. And that is such a powerful Kubernetes GUI. I really like it. But that's written in Go too.
It's fantastic, isn't it? Yeah, there's a lot. I think that's been one of the big deciding factors in Go's popularity is the fact that it entered the market at the right time. It was obviously backed Kubernetes as well, because that was a Google product. And I think that's definitely one of the things that have helped Go's adoption is because Kubernetes, is a Google technology. It was written in Go. A lot of the big players out there like Docker in the early cloud infrastructure space are written in Go. And also I think because of when they released Go, they released a version promise where they wouldn't break backwards compatibility until sort of version 2. And they're still very early, even though it came out in 2007, it's still Go version 1, and they've lived up to that promise. So tooling vendors could know that if they wrote their code in Go, they weren't going to be broken anytime soon. And that's, I think, really helped, embed the language into the cloud native ecosystem. That's why you see a lot of the cloud native tooling written in Go, and definitely kind of one of the things that I think has helped it succeed as a language. So yeah, you naturally see things like this K9S tool that you mentioned written in Go as well. Yeah, and I suppose it seems quite well suited to that. I mean, I'm a big fan of K9S as well, and you probably are because of the the Vim bindings, but maybe we'll save that for later.
I don't know how good I think it's quite good anyway, because I know the team I'm currently working with, so I'm aware we've kind of like digressed from Go again, but the team I'm working with, because we were using Lens, but because of the licensing, and it's a big company, they'd have to get a company-wide license, so everyone switched to K9S. And so people are liking it, but as you say, because for Vim users, it puts it on steroids.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, it's so good. But anyway, let's save Vim to the next episode, which will be a week later, but for us, it'll be half an hour, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, when you drop into K9S or anything with Vim bindings, I suppose, you're like, is it Alex from Jurassic Park, the first one, the young girl who sits down at the computer, and she says, "This is Unix, I know this." It's kind of the same when I drop into an editor that has Vim bindings. I'm like, it's got Vim bindings, I know this.
Oh dear, I so want to continue this conversation, but let's wait for the second episode.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned before about link and like maybe missing link. Flipping that on its head, are there things that you've experienced in Go that .NET didn't have, and you wouldn't like to not have that now?
I suppose for me, another design philosophy of Go is to have fast compile times, and the compile times in Go are fantastic. That's one thing I really, really miss when I go to another language such as C# or lately I've been dabbling with Rust, and again I just miss how fast Go compiles. It's extraordinarily fast. I think there's even the Prometheus maintainers, they have this huge Prometheus code base written in Go, and it compiles in 3 or 4 seconds. It's really impressive, and that's kind of a target they really try and push. And one of their aims is to have a very a code base and have a compiler that is lightning quick. And that's probably the biggest thing I miss. And then also the simplicity of it. I think sometimes because it's a new language, it's had the opportunity to start afresh, learn from lots of mistakes, or learn from history, and it hasn't had to go through this change we've seen, going from a single core to multi-core world, and from a single server to a distributed architecture, and a lot of that kind of isn't there. A lot of that history and cruft that collects over time isn't there, and I suppose I miss those. And then the syntax, I don't know, there's something about a syntax. Sometimes it just feels right. I don't know why. It writes fast. I mean, that might be because I use Vim now, but it just feels snappy. The workflow, being able to make changes, run your tests super quick. They run very quickly because it compiles quickly. I think that's really it. And just all of the tooling around it. As I mentioned earlier, they developed Go to be a software engineering language. There's a lot of tooling, such as testing is part of the core language. It's not, some additional add-on. And it has all those bits and pieces that you need. So I think that's really a lot of the things I miss. And I'm not the most expert programmer, so because it moves at a slower pace, I don't find myself having to learn these new features every single 3 months or every single release, where all of a sudden there's some new syntax added that I have to relearn or figure out what it's doing.
Well, in .NET we get that every year now with a new release. The next one's in a few weeks, so a whole bunch of new stuff to learn there. So yeah, there's definitely something to be said for that.
I suppose it comes though. I was thinking, having spent some time in the Go ecosystem, it's quite interesting because at the same time, because the language does evolve slowly, you don't get the same flooding of new language features that people start talking about and posting videos about and blogging about. It does feel somewhat stagnant in that case, in terms of blog posts and media being created, because it evolves so slowly. When a new version comes out, you see this explosion of blog posts about new versions, but they're never anything too exciting. I think the most dramatic language update there's been is generics. That was, release of this year, however many years now, since 2007. So yeah, I suppose that's one of the benefits you get from a continuously or a faster evolving language is you get this fresh content all the time, which I kind of miss, I suppose.
It was quite interesting. I hadn't actually thought about that, where like maybe for a language that isn't updating as often, there's less community stuff. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, or we can cut it out if you do, but I know you've mentioned to me before you've considered starting a podcast about Go. Is that okay to talk about, or?
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to do it now, aren't I? Now you said it. No, it is something I've considered. I think prior to working fully remote and working in Go, I've always enjoyed community stuff. I used to run, say, the .NET Southwest meetup in Bristol, which I really enjoyed. And now working remotely full time, I kind of miss some of those community interactions that I once had. So I have considered. And because Go is much smaller, the Go community is much smaller than, say, the .NET community. And because the language evolves slower, there's not a huge amount. I think there's one main podcast, which is Go Time FM. And it is something I've considered doing. So, maybe watch the space. But it depends on how much effort it is and how persistent I would be. Because sometimes it's hard when, some nights you just want to program, and anything that takes you away from that, I don't know how well I'll do at sticking at it.
Well, you've definitely got all the gear, because you've got like quite a decent mic setup, and it was when I got this Rodecaster Pro 2, it was you that we had a call that was, I've forgotten what we were talking about now, we just had a catch-up call, and then you showed me yours, and all the stuff it could do, all the different faders and mixing and special effects, and I was like, I've got to have one, so I ended up ordering one straight away, and yeah, so thank you, but yeah, you've got like all the setup for starting the podcast, so you're like halfway there already.
Yeah, well, funnily, when we had the discussion, it's because I wanted to ask you some opinions on podcasting, because it was something I was considering doing.
Oh, that was it. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people went through the stage when lockdown happened. People had to start investing in, working from home equipment, buying new microphones, or organizations. Some people were lucky enough to work for companies that would give people a budget to be able to buy new equipment. And certainly where the company I moved to now, they also gave you a budget for remote workers. So I was fortunate to be able to, invest in, and also by saying to my wife that if I'm working from home now, maybe I could get a bit of a budget to, to pimp out my office space a bit. And I can order stuff to the office, and she won't know it's here as well. So
yeah, I've got the advantage that because I'm a consultant running through my own company, which has its own business account, things that relate to work I can expense, so I don't need to ask permission. So that's helpful. It's not out of our personal finances.
Yes, yeah, I definitely see the benefits of that.
So before we wrap up and do dev picks, if any of the listeners decide they want to go out and dabble and play and learn Go, are there some really good resources you do recommend?
Yeah, I suppose it applies to, any developer looking at broadening their language experience. So I suppose given we're talking about Go, we'll probably have some people that might be interested in learning Go. But any language really is always nice to kind of broaden your language experience if you've got the time. In terms of Go, VS Code is a good place to start. There's superb language support in VS Code. And then go.dev is probably the next place. Go.dev. Yeah, go.dev. And they've got a nice sort of getting started section where you can take you through downloading it, installing it, and then they've got a playground, and you can follow along with some simple demonstrations of the language. And it's really a case then, for me personally, it was a case of finding some side projects or some simple repositories that I wanted to commit to, and that's kind of where I began, was looking at building some side projects and contributing to some open source projects in areas that I was interested in. The Go community is really welcoming of new people. So, you'll generally find a lot of help. There's a good Go for Slack channel as well, where people are very keen to help newcomers. And I think that's about it, really. It's really not a difficult language to pick up, so it really doesn't take much of a commitment either. And I think that's kind of one of the rewarding things about it is it's quite easy to pick up.
Yeah, thinking about we mentioned K9S before, which is open source and Go. There's a feature that I really, really want in there. So maybe that's my opportunity to dip my toe with Go. But, you can view the namespaces, but you can only select one that's the current active namespace, which you can browse around. I'm used to with Lens, where you can select a few. Like if you're working on different namespaces, you can select a few. And all the pods and everything, you're seeing them filtered by those namespaces. Where with K9S, you can't do it more than one. So you're either seeing one namespace or all of them. So I know there's a ticket about that, but maybe that's my opportunity to do a PR or something.
You'd be surprised that that's how many people start, from a simple thing like that. As I mentioned earlier, Go is really designed to allow it to be picked up quickly and also really, really performant. So you'd be surprised actually how easy it would be to make such small changes, some small changes via, a language which you've never used before. Definitely one of its strengths.
And I have a JetBrains Ultimate license, so that would include Goland. So
yes, it would do, yes. But Go support in Vim is really good. NeoVim with an LSP, which we'll talk about later, is also, really good support there. So you could maybe even try it in Vim.
Watch this space. Shall we do dev picks?
Yes, let's do it.
Would you like to go first?
Oh, yes. Okay. So my dev pick, I think, is a mixture of things, really. It's a topic I find quite interesting. There's a fantastic book I read recently from somebody called Amy Edmondson. It's The Fearless Organization. And it's talking about the importance of creating psychological safety in the workplace. I think there was a Project Aristotle, I believe it was called, from Google, where they internally interviewed a number of different teams to gauge what they felt made a good team. And I think the leading indicator was psychological safety. It feels like from all the research that has been done in this area, and you can see this in various different research papers and studies, that psychological safety really underpins a lot of healthy working environments. I suppose it just echoes back to creating nice environments for people. I think sometimes in tech, it's very easy to focus on the tech and forget the people side. So I think anything that focuses on people and creating, healthy working environments where people can get along and agree in it and disagree in a healthy manner would be my tip. So definitely take a look at the book. It's a fantastic book, and it's a really, really interesting area of research.
Yeah, that's such an important topic. I think especially now in our industry, where a lot of us are remote. So that's even more important because everyone's just isolated on their own, speaking into a webcam. So just having that where everyone feels like they can have a voice, even if they've made a mistake or they want to ask a question which they're worried might sound dumb or something, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Everyone should feel that they can do that.
Yeah, and it does really stem from, local team culture. But if you can be the person to ask a stupid question or a silly question or a question that you may look like a fool, sometimes that kind of starts to encourage this culture of it's okay to ask questions that that may and expose yourself to interpersonal risk. I think that's one of the interesting things the book talks about, is how some leaders have gone into organizations and been aware of this culture that's sort of manifested in itself about sort of unsafe psychological environments, and they've encouraged it themselves by, being somebody to ask questions that may put them at some kind of interpersonal risk, and just kind of encourage that from the ground up. But yeah, I'm rambling now. I think you're spot on there, really.
Well, there's who was it that said this? Jim Quick, I think. There's a phrase he always hammers on about because he's like a big advocate of asking questions, and he says questions create deeper understanding. And that's true. By asking questions all the time, that's how you understand things deeply. Even if it's not asking a question to a person, if it's asking a question, like you're asking yourself a question and you're curious about it, and then you go and read up on it because you want that question to be answered. I think like questions are so important.
Yeah, I agree.
So my dev tip is kind of like feels very trivial after that quite important thing, but this is just a silly little thing. So I'm quite a heavy command line user, and my go-to shell is PowerShell, and I've used it for a while, so I was a bit surprised that I didn't know this already. But recently I accidentally hit, when you're doing auto-completion and I would normally hit tab, for some reason I accidentally hit control space. And instead of auto-completion, I just got a big list of all the available options, and which I could use the cursor keys to. I couldn't use the Vim keys, but I'd use the cursor keys. But I could use the cursor keys to move around and just select the one I wanted. And it's any kind of autocomplete. So if you start typing a directory path or something, you can autocomplete that with control space, and then you can select the one you want. If it's because PowerShell, a lot of the arguments are typed. If you start typing an argument, control space, and you get a list of all the arguments that would match what you've typed so far. So I think it's just quite a nice, powerful productivity tip for the command line.
Gotta love the productivity tips.
Oh, definitely. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out for you if they have any questions?
Probably the best place is on Twitter. On Twitter, I'm _Joseph Woodward. I presume you'll probably include it in the show notes. It's probably the best place to go. But yeah, any questions, any experiences? I'm always keen to talk to people, get to know people. So that's probably it.
Cool. And a big thank you for joining us talking about Go. And I'll see you in 5 minutes for the next episode. Awesome. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we'll include links to all the stuff we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.